There is a chair in Rome that more than 1 billion people believe was carved out for one man by Jesus himself, the seat of a single ruler over every Christian on earth, handed down from Peter in an unbroken line for 2,000 years. It is one of the most powerful claims in human history, and it has a problem. If you go back to the very beginning, to the New Testament, to the church the apostles actually planted, that chair is not there. There is no single ruler. There is one supreme head, and he was not a man, and he was not in Rome. And here is the detail almost no one has ever told you. One of the most revered bishops of Rome himself, around the year 600, called any man who dared to claim he was the universal head of the whole church a forerunner of the antichrist. A bishop of Rome said that, about the very office that would later become the papacy. In this video, we are going to trace step by step and date by date where the pope actually came from. Because Jesus did not hand Peter that throne. Men built it, brick by brick, across centuries. And once you can see it, you will not be able to unsee it. This channel is brand new, so before we go on, if you want videos that go back before Rome, to what the first Christians actually did, subscribe and ring the bell. It decides whether the next one ever reaches you. And tell me in the comments what you were taught about the Pope growing up. I read every one. One honest word first. I did not learn this in a seminary. I dug it out on my own, reading the New Testament and the earliest church history for myself. I wrote down what I found, every date, every source, in a short guide called Be Your Own Pastor, for people who would rather check a thing than be told it. It is linked below. Now, let us start where the church actually started. Open the New Testament and look for the single ruling head of the church, and you will not find him. What you find in city after city is a team of elders, plural, with no one man set above them. Paul writes to Philippi and greets the bishops, plural, and the deacons of that one single city. Philippians chapter 1, verse 1. He gathers the elders, plural, of Ephesus and calls those same men the overseers of the flock. Acts chapter 20, verses 17 and 28. And Peter himself, the supposed first pope, writes to the elders and calls himself in his own hand, not the prince of the apostles, not the supreme pontiff, but a fellow elder. He tells them plainly not to lord it over the flock, but to be examples to it, and he points them, not to himself, but to the one chief shepherd who is still to come. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. Peter knew of only one chief shepherd over the church, and it was not Peter. The head of the church, Paul says, is Christ. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 22. The first church did have a head. It simply was not a man, and it was not in Rome. And this was not an accident or an oversight, as if the apostles simply forgot to appoint a supreme leader. It was deliberate, because Jesus had forbidden that whole way of leading, in the plainest words. When two of his disciples asked for the top seats, he called them all together and said, Ye know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. But it shall not be so among you. But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. Matthew chapter 20, verses 25 through 26. It shall not be so among you. The world builds pyramids, with one man at the top ruling everyone below. Jesus said, My kingdom does not work that way, and he turned the pyramid upside down, putting the greatest at the bottom as the servant of all. So the apostles built exactly what he commanded, not one ruler over a city, but a team of elders in every city, appointed side by side. Paul left Titus in Crete for this reason, that thou shouldest ordain elders in every city. Titus chapter 1, verse 5. Elders, plural, in every city. And in Acts, Paul and Barnabas ordained them elders in every church. Acts chapter 14, verse 23. Again, plural, in every single church. There is no first pope in that picture, and there is no room for one, because the king already forbade the throne. Now, someone is already thinking of the one verse the whole claim hangs on, Matthew chapter 16, where Jesus says, Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. And here is what they almost never read to you, the verse right before it. Jesus asks the disciples, Who do you say that I am? And Peter answers, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And it is right after that confession that Jesus says, Upon this rock I will build my church. The rock is the confession, the truth that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And we do not even have to guess, because Peter tells us himself what the rock is. In his own letter, he says the church is built on Christ, the living stone, the chief cornerstone, and that we, all of us, are living stones built upon him. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 6. Peter never once called himself the foundation. He pointed to Christ as the foundation, exactly like Paul, who wrote that other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 11. One rock, and it is not a man in Rome. And here is what should settle it beyond any argument. Look at how Peter himself actually behaved, and at how the other apostles treated him, because it is nothing like a pope. When Peter walked into the house of Cornelius, the man fell down at his feet to worship him, and Peter did the exact opposite of what any pope has ever done. He took him up, saying, "Stand up. I myself also am a man." Acts chapter 10, verses 25 and 26. Stand up. I am only a man. No ring held out to be kissed, no throne, no title, no crown. And years later, when Peter made a serious and public mistake in Antioch, drawing back from the Gentile believers out of fear of what other men would think, the Apostle Paul did something that no one on earth could ever do to a supreme and infallible head of the church. But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. Galatians chapter 2, verse 11. Paul rebuked Peter publicly to his face, and then wrote it down for the whole church to read forever. You simply cannot publicly correct and blame a man whom the church claims cannot err when he acts for the faith. And Peter was plainly a married man. Jesus healed his wife's mother, Matthew chapter 8, verse 14. And Paul mentions that Peter traveled with his believing wife, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5. So there is the real Peter of the New Testament, a married fisherman who called himself a fellow elder, who told a kneeling man to stand up because he was only a man himself, and who was corrected by another apostle in front of everyone. He would not have recognized the office that was later built in his name, and he certainly never sat in it. And being able to check a claim like that yourself, reading the verse before the famous one, letting Peter define his own words, is exactly the skill I tried to hand people in that guide. But back to the history. So, where does the single ruler actually come from? Watch the dates, because the dates tell the whole story. First, the one bishop ruling over a city appears. The earliest Christian writer to push hard for a single bishop set over the elders and the people is Ignatius of Antioch, around the year 110, already a full generation after the apostles were gone. Then, slowly, one city's bishop begins to claim authority over the rest. Rome was the capital of the empire. Peter and Paul had died there, so its bishop was honored. But to be honored is not the same as to be obeyed. For centuries, the churches settled their greatest questions in councils of many bishops, arguing as equals, never by one man's command. The claim that the Bishop of Rome rules the whole church grows one step at a time. Leo I presses it hard in the 400s. It keeps expanding for centuries, and the full papal monarchy, the Pope as we know him, is a creation of the Middle Ages, 1,000 years after Peter. This is not an office that Jesus created. It is a tower raised across 1,000 years, long after every apostle was already in the grave. And here is the fact that ends the argument, and it comes from the mouth of Rome itself. Around the year 590, one of the most respected bishops of Rome in all of history, Gregory I, the one they still call Gregory the Great, heard that a bishop had taken for himself the title universal bishop, the one head over all the churches. And Gregory was horrified. He wrote that whoever calls himself the universal bishop, or desires to be so called, is in his pride the forerunner of antichrist. Read that slowly. A bishop of Rome, a pope by the later reckoning, said that any man who claims to be the universal head of the whole church is the forerunner of antichrist. He said no bishop anywhere should ever wear that title, because it belongs to no man. And yet within a couple of centuries, the bishops of Rome would claim exactly that title, and build the entire papacy upon it. The office condemns itself out of its own history. Peter would never have recognized it, and one of Rome's own greatest bishops called it in advance by its true name. And it is worse than a slow, honest drift, because when the historical evidence for papal supremacy ran thin, documents were produced to fill the gap, and those documents turned out to be forgeries. For centuries, the popes leaned on a writing called the Donation of Constantine, which claimed that the Emperor Constantine had personally handed supreme authority over the whole church and over the Western Empire itself to the Bishop of Rome. It was used again and again to justify enormous papal power over kings and nations. And then, in the 15th century, a scholar named Lorenzo Valla proved, from the very language and wording of the document, that it was a fake, written centuries after Constantine was already dead. The same proved true of another famous collection, the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals, a body of forged letters and canons used all through the Middle Ages to prop up the authority of Rome, and later exposed by historians as counterfeit. Now, think carefully about what that means. A claim that has to be supported by forged documents was never resting on apostolic truth in the first place. The genuine article does not need to be propped up with fakes. And all the while, the New Testament never once wavers on who the one head of the church actually is. And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence. Colossians chapter 1, verse 18. The church already has a head, a living, risen, present head, and his name is Jesus Christ. Peter called him the chief shepherd who shall appear. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 4. And the writer of Hebrews calls him a great high priest who ever lives to make intercession for us. A body does not need two heads. Christ has never vacated that office, never died a second time, never handed it down to a successor, and never needed a man in a city to stand in his place. He is not an absentee king who left a deputy on the throne. He promised, "Lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world." Matthew chapter 28, verse 20, and he meant it. So put the timeline together. The Apostles' Church, plural elders, and Christ the only head. The single city bishop, Ignatius, around 110. Roman supremacy, pressed by Leo in the 400s and built up over 1,000 years. And the very title universal head, condemned by Rome's own Gregory as the mark of the forerunner of antichrist before it was ever fully claimed. Nowhere in that entire story is a throne handed to Peter by Jesus. Peter was a married fisherman who called himself a fellow elder and pointed everyone he could to the one chief shepherd. And here is the deepest reason the church never needed a supreme earthly head, and never will. It already has a living one who never dies, never retires, and never has to be replaced. The whole problem with any human office is that men die, and so you need a successor, and then another, and then another, an unbroken chain held together by men. But listen to what Hebrews says about Christ's leadership of his church. But this man, because he continueth ever, hath an unchangeable priesthood. Wherefore he is able also to save them to the uttermost that come unto God by him, seeing he ever liveth to make intercession for them. Hebrews chapter 7, verses 24 and 25. An unchangeable priesthood, because he continues forever. He never dies, so he never needs a successor. He is not an absent founder who had to leave a deputy in charge. He ever lives, right now, actively leading and interceding for his people. And he said there would be one flock and one shepherd. John chapter 10, verse 16. Not one flock and a long line of under-shepherds ruling from a throne, but one flock under one living shepherd who is always present. That is why the apostles felt no need to install a pope. Why would you appoint a man to permanently stand in for a king who never left the room? The pope was not founded by Christ. He was invented, slowly, by men, against the plain design of the first church, and against the warning of Rome's own best bishop. And here is a fact that quietly demolishes the idea of 2,000 years of universal papal rule. For the first 1,000 years, half of all Christians on earth never accepted it, and still do not to this day. The great churches of the East, the Greek-speaking Christians of Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem, honored the Bishop of Rome as one respected bishop among several, but they never once recognized him as the supreme ruler over the whole church. When Rome finally pressed that claim too hard, the result was the Great Schism of 1054, when Eastern and Western Christianity split apart, and the entire eastern half of the church walked away rather than bow to a single universal head. Half the Christian world, closer to the apostles in language and in time than Rome itself, looked at the claim of a supreme pope and said no. And even in the West, the strongest voices resisted the idea. Cyprian of Carthage, back in the 200s, presided over a council of bishops and declared plainly that not one of them set himself up as a bishop of bishops or forced his colleagues to obey him by tyrannical terror. A bishop of bishops was exactly what the papacy would later become, and one of the most respected early bishops had already rejected the very concept. So the claim of an unbroken, universally accepted line of supreme popes from Peter is not history. It is a story told after the fact, and half the church was never in the room to agree to it. And that famous phrase, the unbroken line, does not survive contact with the actual history either, because the line was broken again and again. For most of the early centuries, the title Pope, which simply means father, was not reserved for the Bishop of Rome at all. It was used of many bishops, and the Bishop of Alexandria in Egypt was commonly called Pope as well. It was only later that Rome claimed the word for itself alone, and the supposedly unbroken succession is littered with rival claimants, with men the church itself later branded anti-popes, and with one stretch of history so chaotic it should end the argument by itself. From the year 1378, for nearly 40 years, there were two men, and then at one point, three men, all at the same time, each calling himself the one true pope, each with his own followers and his own cardinals, and each solemnly excommunicating the other two and everyone who followed them. Read that slowly. For 4 decades, the church had two or three rival popes cursing one another as impostors, and to this day, scholars argue over which line was the legitimate one. That is the Western Schism, and it is not a rumor from Rome's enemies. It is written plainly in the church's own history. An office that could split into two and three rival heads, each damning the others, is not a smooth, unbroken throne handed down untouched from Peter. It is a human institution, with all the fractures and power struggles of any human institution, exactly what you would expect from a throne that men built and not one that Christ established. So the real question is simple. Will you belong to the church with one man at the top that men assembled over 1,000 years, or to the church the apostles actually left behind, the one with no head but Christ, still sitting there in the pages of your own New Testament, waiting for you to read it? That, honestly, is the whole reason I made the guide I keep mentioning. It is called Be Your Own Pastor, and it is short and practical. How to read the New Testament for yourself, with no institution standing between you and the text. How to check the famous proof texts in their real context. And how to trace any office or doctrine back to where it actually began, with the dates and sources I used here. I am not going to put a number on it. Go and see for yourself. It is linked right below this video, and there is a code on the screen right now. I made it for the person who would simply rather check than be told. Now, before we close, if this opened your eyes, do the one thing that keeps this new channel alive. Subscribe, ring the bell, and comment which fact surprised you most. The plural elders, the real meaning of the rock, or Rome's own Gregory calling the universal head title the forerunner of antichrist. Next time, we go back before Rome again and pull up another piece of the machine to see who really put it there. Until then, go and read the church the apostles left for yourself. It has no head but Christ, and it never once needed a throne in Rome. Peace be with you.